getting into parasites a little bit, I kind of want to understand this landscape a little bit better because it seems like a lot of people are attributing parasites to being a primary. Like I've heard it go as far as like parasites are the problem.
Hmm.
And then I just want to understand the landscape of parasites in the United States, like how prevalent it is, how much of a factor it is, and then how do we know? So I know that's kind of a lot to unpack, but maybe we can just start there. Like how
Yeah.
prevalent are parasites in first world countries like the United States?
Well, parasites, I mean, the reason that, well, the reason that I suppose that we're having this talk today, Micah, is they're popular, or at least they're discussed. So whenever an item is, you see it on Instagram, you see it, YouTube or in other forms of popular media, it's always on people's minds. In terms of like how prevalent parasites are, obviously we're going to be talking mostly about the United States because that's where we live. But I mean, just globally, they're actually fairly prevalent, particularly around the equator where you're talking about more tropical environments. So in the United States, fairly low. That's a lot of that has to do with obviously our sanitation, particularly water, our water system. But if you look globally, according to the World Health Organization, about 25% of the population has an infection right now. You go move towards the equator, start looking about 50% of the population. So it's actually fairly common. And in terms of looking at the more industrialized areas of the world, like say Europe, Western Europe, and the United States, the two main parasites that are really kind of the majority of those infection rates are giardia. Okay, so this is protozoa, single cell organism, and pinworm. And those infection rates together are about 70 or 7%. Sorry. So that's pretty significant. The issue, of course, with parasites is you don't really know that you have them um, until you get tested. Beyond having the common itchiness at night with like pinworm, you'll feel your anus kind of itch. These really kind of have, I think, a lot of people worried about do I have them or not, and that paranoia I think is it's one of the reasons that they're kind of popular right now because there are symptoms associated with parasites that are pretty easy to, nail down to like, okay, yeah, you have a parasite. The itching is one, sudden changes in gastrointestinal functioning, but other symptoms can be a little bit harder to tie to parasites or other health conditions in general. Fatigue, not absorbing micronutrients correctly, which giardia can actually do, even lactose intolerance. So I think there's a thirst, nowadays with just the number of health conditions that people are experiencing is to actually get a diagnosis or to understand something that they can actually treat to solve their health symptom, which is totally understandable. I think the issue is though just thinking that it's a parasite or thinking it's XYZ and not really knowing for sure.
Is there a way to definitively know if you have parasites or not?
Well, so the common parasites, it's pretty easy to diagnose those. For instance, with pinworm, there's the very common Scotch tape test. You can literally take a clear piece of tape, put it on your anus, and we use microscopes, basically to see, if you have the larva, the egg. Others, you can do antigen tests. This is very common using basically ELISA type methods. There is some imaging that's a little bit harder to nail down. Blood tests, as I was mentioning with antigens, I mean, metabolomics. Certainly there's now a lot of interest in getting a metabolic signature of what some of these infections might look like. And a lot of this can come down to altered metabolism related to nutrition, because if you think about where these oftentimes microorganisms, or they can be a little bit larger in the case of something like a pinworm, where they're residing, they're interacting with your microbiota and they're interacting with the nutrients that you're bringing in. So what we see in terms of what's getting absorbed can be affected. But generally, these are fairly easy to detect. Something that we're actually working on right now is looking at a fecal sample to detect genomic information from these organisms with a better catalog of all the different types of parasites. And that's something that we're still developing. But I mean, to get a definitive answer for most of the common parasites that you will find in the West, the United States, for instance, or even other developing areas, there are pretty quick and easy ways to detect this.
So with the fecal sample and using genomic testing, you would essentially be looking at the sample and saying like, hey, this genetic strain does not belong to a human. This belongs to this parasite. And so you're just getting like everything downstream of those parasites you'll be able to see within that sample.
Exactly. So that's the same way that we annotate the microbes that are, say beneficial to their residence in your gastrointestinal tract. But I mean, pathogens are ancient to humans. They're ancient to all creatures on this earth. In fact, if you look at our own genetic makeup, our own DNA, about 8 of our DNA is viral, retroviruses. And these were just basically remnants from old infections that we just harbored for, for very long periods of time. But we actually find that these can be somewhat beneficial in terms of kind of priming our immune system and helping to fight infection. So when we talk about parasites, I mean, if you have little kids, you might have gone through, pinworms. It's fairly common in the United States, particularly in children, but they're not fun. I mean, it's not something that you want to go through. The body has been dealing with these for a long, long time, and it can handle it. Now, there's always going to be trade-offs, obviously. Actually, at Arizona State University here, there is a really interesting line of research, an investigator called Benjamin, or his name is Benjamin Trumbull. And he does a lot of work with tribes in the Amazon. And one tribe in particular in Bolivia, he's done a tremendous job at profiling everything, right down to, their fecal samples. And he's found that about 80 to 90% of these individuals have parasites. They're full of parasites. They also have some of the lowest rates of cardiovascular disease. There's this kind of hypothesis that while parasites can be detrimental in other ways, particularly related to growth, these people aren't very tall. It can really affect, how much nutrition you're absorbing, which can play into how you're developing as a human. Constantly having to deal with parasites, you're constantly priming your immune system, particularly your T cells. So you kind of have this dampening effect where we know that chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease are largely inflammatory diseases. So they kind of get this benefit from priming their immune system and having this inflammation dampening effect. But on the other side of it, they have parasites. So it's just kind of interesting to get that perspective.
And what about like cancers and stuff? Was he just looking at cardiovascular markers, or did he look at other disease states as well?
He has a whole line of research around this particular tribe.
What's his name?
Benjamin Trumbull. He's looked at all manner of outcomes, actually even related to DNA. I believe he's looked at how epigenetics might be playing a role with some of these adaptations. Now, I'm not advocating you go out and get parasites to lower your risk of getting cardiovascular disease. I'm just
it doesn't mean that. Yeah, just
right. Well,
yeah.
I'm just making sure that that's not taken the wrong way. So this ties into hygiene, right? Because living in Western society, obviously we have fairly high standards of hygiene. We're washing our hands very often. We're using a host of different types of chemical agents to make sure our environments are very the ways that we've been living for a long time. In fact, there is a hypothesis called the hygiene hypothesis, which basically argues that there's a mismatch between our current sanitary urban environments and the conditions which we've, as humans, experienced for the majority of our time. So if you kind of evolve to deal or cope with high levels of pathogens, but now you're in a situation where you're not, what this basically does is you have a lack of immune stimulation. And this can actually result in dysregulated immune function and activation later in life, and it can actually cause exaggerated immune responses. And this is a reason I think he's looking at this angle, because you see cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease as extremely prevalent in Western society. And these are, as I said, inflammatory. So it might be one area or one explanation for what we're seeing. I mean, obviously, there's other factors, diet, exercise, etc. But that's kind of an interesting perspective. Again, going back to having these pathogens, like I'm not advocating for you to seek it out, but we want to be careful with thinking that we might have something, not confirming it through some type of diagnostic panel, and then taking various agents to get rid of them. Now, there's a lot of, home remedies being floated around about, how to handle this. Those can be less of an issue. There's all sorts of natural remedies like wormwood tinctures, MCT oil, black walnut. Garlic is very popular, raw garlic. Those, may not be as problematic as actually going and getting pharmaceuticals, or even some people don't fully understand that, these aren't necessarily bacterial. Oftentimes they're not bacterial. Going and taking full courses of antibiotics, that is totally not warranted. And again, what we really prescribe and advocate here at Theriome is what type of metabolic profile or whatever health condition you're trying to get a better handle on. Having that diagnostic panel is extremely powerful and extremely important, because you want to be as precise as possible with any type of treatment or any type of intervention.
I haven't gotten into the world of parasites much, but I know it's more in niche circles where it's not necessarily a huge topic, but I've seen it come up, and I've watched like a few minutes here and there, and people kind of attribute all sorts of different issues, disease states, and things to parasites, and they're basically arguing that it's much more prevalent than what we say it is. So I don't know, are you familiar with anybody that we can kind of like, because I would like to understand, so if there are clinicians out there kind of claiming this, like I think it's very easy for people to get to a point where they hear a really cool narrative, like a clinician is saying this about parasites, that's very prevalent, that's a cause of many issues, so you want to understand if you have parasites, and like they give kind of symptomatic diagnostic tools to people to, then self-diagnose if they have parasites or not. And then the argument is, well, we actually don't have good enough diagnostics and an understanding of parasites to say that we, basically like, well, you have parasites, we just don't have the tools to know for sure if you have them or not. And then it kind of perpetuates this idea that and again, this is kind of like in a smaller area. I wouldn't say this is like broad population. But it would be interesting if you do have any information about that, or clinicians who are have made that argument, and if there's kind of a rebuttal to that, or like, hey, this is my understanding of it. So I don't know if you can kind of place that into context, maybe some of the thought processes going on there, and how you differ from that. I know that's super vague.
Well, I mean, this is
and it's kind of like a straw man, right? Because you're not actually having a discussion with them. But I'm just trying to wrap my own head around it.
Well, I mean, I think you're going to have really kind of two sides to this this dynamic. You're going to have obviously organizations like the World Health Organization, the CDC. They're going to present you with prevalence, incidence data. But again, that comes down to the flaws of surveying populations. And there's always going to be problems with that. We can look at a very easy to understand example would be survey data. You're taking a subset of the population, you're trying to extrapolate that and apply it, to a large population. With research, we're doing a lot of the same things. Is it possible that when we say 25% of the world's population has an infection related to intestinal parasites, that number's not 100% accurate? Obviously, but this is giving us a ballpark figure. Now, in relation to the types of parasites, it is certainly within the realm of possibility. Certain types of parasites that we can't as accurately profile or diagnose as the more common ones that I mentioned, like giardia, the protozoa, or pinworm. So there may be individuals that live in more sanitized societies, environments, like here in the United States, that have, what we would term relatively rare parasites, and are suffering some very, nondiscrete or hard to pin down, symptoms. Chronic fatigue, of course, that's one that's brought up very often, and that could be related to so many different types of factors, like what I was talking about with giardia, related to how that's affecting your nutrition. Those that are diagnosed with giardia, oftentimes we find that they suffer from fatigue, and it could be associated with not absorbing nutrients like actually lactose, vitamin A, folate, vitamin B12. So giardia, that single cell organism, when it gets in your gastrointestinal tract, it actually uses protein or enzymes that break down a lot of the structure that we have in our brush border, the villi, that are responsible for pulling in a lot of that nutrition. So you get an erosion in the brush border, and then the microbiome, your own microbiome, the microorganisms that are, could be beneficial to your health, they start to encroach upon that area, and then they cause an immune response. That area gets inflamed, and then we have a whole issue now, kind of systemically along the gastrointestinal tract. We're just having absorption issues. So that right there could, that could relate to chronic fatigue. And these parasites could be behaving in a similar way, say, as giardia, where they're preventing the absorption of some particular nutrient, or they're spurring an inflammation response. So if we don't have, say, through a genetic, looking at the genome of these parasites, or for whatever reason we can't do microscopy, or it requires really invasive, maybe they're residing in the upper area of your gastrointestinal tract, so they're not really around in your colon or something, where you get a fecal sample pretty easily. You have to do a colonoscopy. Now we're looking at trying to do a suite of tests, which in some diseases, obviously, we have to do. So we're not relying on one antigen, looking at one ELISA test, or we're not looking at one imaging result. We have to start looking at, okay, what might be in the blood. Maybe we start seeing lipopolysaccharides, a specific type, from a parasite, or we see a certain type of metabolomic profile that's associated. But we have to have these layers of testing to really confirm. And that's where things get complex. And I feel like when you start going down this rabbit hole, and this can be applied to not just parasites, but a lot of different health conditions, that can be pretty problematic. And I don't want to say a lot of people in this space are trying to lead people down a particular trail. But I think I don't blame people for, going down these trails, because a lot of times they do have a problem and they want answers. And they're having a hard time finding answers, but it's giving people the proper diagnostic tools and the proper information. And, I will look at the World Health Organization. I will look at the CDC, but I'll also be open-minded to look at other channels of information and not get totally blocked off or blind myself to a vector of information just because, I think that this is the right way. Testing is definitely important, but it's, again, it's trying to be precise with that type of testing. Looking at the symptoms, getting the laboratory test if warranted, and then obviously linking up with the right type of physician, the right type of testing that can get you a more informed decision on actually what's going on.
Are there very many prevalent organizations that are providing genomic data from stool samples to identify parasites at this point? Like, are there yeah, because it sounds like to me, like, so that seems like the next step in not only microbiome data, but also for these parasites, because what I imagine that we'll see is that we'll be able to identify new microbes, just lots of different pieces of information that will be really helpful to understanding what's associated with a positive health state. what's associated with a disease state, all that kind of information. So is like, how would you suggest somebody profile for parasites based off of what is currently available in the marketplace?
Yeah, this is a really blossoming space. I do believe there are some pretty good companies out there. They're not using the good ones that I've looked into. They're not using just one metric. They'll use traditional antigen tests. They'll use microscopy. They'll use the genomic testing from stool samples. So I think if you're really, and your physician is also kind of on this same track, thinking that this could be, an issue, I would try to get these more global tests where you're getting a better picture of what we currently have available in terms of diagnostics. I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of the microbiome space, and also integrating, looking at the metabolites in the feces and the blood, and bringing those three layers together to get a better signature. But that work is actually something that we're interested in and is ongoing. I don't know of anyone out there right now that's able to combine all three of those. They have good panels and good signatures for the variety of different parasites that are out there, at least the most common ones.
So I want to circle back a little bit to the topic of sterilization and having an over-sterilized environment. Obviously, there's environments that can be too pathogenic, too toxic for us as well. You were talking about, people in the Amazon, they have a high parasitic load, but really low rates of cardiovascular disease, which might be related to diet and exercise and those other things that they're probably doing correctly, because they have to go down, chop the tree down, do all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And we're getting in a car that's 72 degrees all the time. It's just different.
Yeah.
But how do you kind of blend with what you kind of see in that space currently? So on the side of over-sterility versus being in too high of a pathogenic area or environment, how do you kind of blend those in practically to say, like, I think this is a good approach for my day-to-day life in, the United States?
Yes, that's a great question. I think
and this is just your opinion, that this doesn't have to be data-based.
Sure. Yeah, I'll give my opinion. I think in general, we are probably erring on the side of being over-sterilized. And I think this has a detrimental effect on how well or how primed our immune system is to handle things. So you can get more disease or a resistant type microbes developing based on this model. And even if you look at parasites, like the common parasites, again, going back to what we have here in the United States, pinworms, for instance, their eggs are extremely resistant. It's very hard to get rid of. Obviously, we have medications to take care of that. That usually that's you're taking them for 3 weeks. You're having to clean your entire house. The eggs themselves, you can get this from water. You can get this oftentimes from soil, but actually, like the main place that you're going to get this from is other people's poop, because that's where you'll find the eggs, of course. But these things can last for months. These eggs can last for months, years. They can't be. We look at like treatment with water. It can't be inactivated by chlorine, UV light, or even ozone. Can't really get rid of them. It's really heat, high heat and very, very low moisture environments that get rid of them. But if you think about it, how often in our environment are we having like extremely high heat?
When you say high heat, do you mean like being in a sauna that's 170 degrees, or do you mean like it needs to be on fire?
Well, yeah, to give you a ballpark, maybe around 40, 45 degrees Celsius. So
I don't think in Celsius. What is that? Fahrenheit.
What's that? In Fahrenheit, you could possibly get that in a sauna.
There was a short time I actually thought in kilos more than pounds when I was weightlifting, because for Olympic weightlifting, all they use is kilos. And when you're lifting all the time, you start to think like, oh, this probably weighs a kilo and a half, or but I haven't gotten there with Celsius yet.
Yeah, so 40 to 45, that's something that you could experience here in the summertime in Phoenix, Arizona. So you're maybe 100, 105,
But you're not
110.
going to get your gut lining up to that temperature,
I wouldn't
even.
recommend it, no.
Yeah, even with hyperthermia, what
Right.
would it get up to with hyperthermia? Do you know? Like
With hypothermia,
like using a really
hyperthermia,
hot sauna.
really hot sauna, I actually don't know. That's a great question. Um, I mean, generally, when we talk about what you experience, I mean, a fever that is very problematic. I mean, it's really not that much. I mean, we maintain we have thermal regulation in a pretty tight range. So you're not. I don't believe you're going to be getting up to 110 degrees. Or it's if you
That'd
are,
be
you're in
yeah,
deep trouble.
be pretty
So
dangerous.
yeah, so I mean, really, with that type of environment, or even just having eggs that are outside, just waiting to be kind of picked up by a host, what I'm trying to say is these are very robust, very hard to very hard to get rid of in our environment, and that's, when someone does get this, I think you shouldn't, fool around with. I mean, not that home remedies don't work necessarily, but I think you should be very targeted and try to get rid of something like pinworm pretty quickly, particularly if you have a family, because it does spread very easily.
Sure. I was kind of like curious about digging into the sterility conversation. I don't know. What are good practices just for ensuring that we're not over-sterilizing, under-sterilizing? Because for people that are more cleanliness minded, it's very easy to say like, I need to use, something to kill everything on the surface of this, and are constantly using chemicals to kind of address the microbes that might be in their environment. What kind of practices? I know you're a scientist, so you're not necessarily making, clinical advice on this kind of stuff, but just kind of a base ballpark of how you approach that system of thought.
It's a good question, and a lot of this is conceptual. Going back to the hygiene hypothesis, we are living in a more sanitized world, but we're also dealing with a lot more people and a lot more potential vectors for exposure. So I think that's actually bad. If we look at, again, taking the more ancestral perspective, you were living probably in a smaller community with your family, perhaps other animals, had pretty constant contact with those individuals. You were obviously clean and whatever, but you weren't traveling a tremendous amount. You weren't coming into contact a lot with those that were outside of your community. You're a lot more intimate, and I mean that kind of from a microbial standpoint with all these individuals. So, you're picking up microbes from the dog or the farm animals. You're in contact with the soil that you're planting crops or whatever with. Now, we have these massive metropolitan areas where we could be in contact with all sorts of different types of people, or at least in contact with surfaces that they were in contact with. Highly transient population, meaning people are constantly traveling to all these different areas, picking up different things. Our water system, of course, has completely changed. Now, obviously, sanitation from just a basic public health perspective is good, right? But also now we have issues with different things entering our water supply.
Yeah, there's so many additives in it now. Like we
Yeah,
have a pretty
so
robust filter system at our house, and in my office here, I just use RO water and then remineralize it.
yeah, so from that standpoint, like these kind of really large changes that have happened, I don't think we're well suited for, at least right now. I mean, perhaps over time we'll adapt, but I mean, in terms of what you can do, the healthy way would be to, I'm not saying go off and live, on a compound with your family and you're in a close community, but I mean, being more intimate with your family in that way, obviously washing your hands and everything, but playing outside, having animals actually seems to be beneficial for when we look at things like diversity in the microbiome. Um, Maybe going out and, drinking all like municipal water in a large metropolitan area and hang out with a bunch of people that you don't really know and just I don't know. I guess I'm kind of weird in that way, but
Yeah.
I try to avoid those types of contacts. And because you don't know people, as I said, with pinworms again, a lot of those eggs, for instance, that's coming from the feces. And there was a study I was reading how nail biting is actually associated with greater prevalence of pinworm infection. And I'm thinking, well, why is that?
Yeah.
Think about where the hand's been, of course. So with other people, you just don't know. That way, I would try to limit exposure with just lots of different types of people that you don't really know that aren't really from your community. Again, I understand that that's avoidable, and a lot of this is just kind of my own opinion. I'm just kind of riffing here, but
Yeah. Well, and I know you're a little bit more predisposed to you're not the life of the party kind of guy where it's like I want to throw a big dinner, throw a party, that kind of stuff, and a bit
right.
more and like myself, right? Like, I'm pretty small in like my immediate community of people, but I do also travel a lot, meet a lot of people, that kind of thing, and so that's a factor. But I'm never trying to personally avoid it. I guess like I mean, my very simplistic approach to it isn't very scientifically informed, but I try to eliminate all the additives that I potentially can as far as like air quality, water quality. So I think getting rid of a lot of the additives that are used in water sterilization can be a positive thing because, they're definitely not great to have in your system if you can avoid them. And so just having good, clean water from that perspective, also from the side of like microbes and parasites and that kind of stuff. I don't want that in the water either. So I understand why it's there. But we personally, like I said, use a pretty robust system. But then I'm also I'm out doing yard work, that kind of stuff. Like I'll wash my hands before I eat, but I'm not like making sure my hands are washed every time that I'm in contact with the soil or different things. I also really try to stay away from, I guess if you thought of it as like broad spectrum antibiotics that are untargeted, I try to, in a similar way, stay away from like just over-sterilization of environment when it's not necessarily needed. So I'm not going to clean off the surface of my desk every day. Maybe a couple times, a month or every couple months, we're cleaning that off, obviously as needed, but just kind of almost taking a common sense approach to where it's like our bodies are historically, and like you said, our ancestors were in contact with this stuff all the time. So it seems appropriate that to a degree I am, and I try to limit infections where possible. So I know that's, kind of vague, but that's kind of my loose rule of thumb that I utilize.
I think it's very sensible. And again, you're living, as well as I know you, you do travel, right? But you're spending most of your time in your smaller community with your family. You're not in a place like where I'm at, with or now I think it's now over 5 million people in the metropolitan area. So I mean, I have so many so my chance for getting all these different exposures are tremendously increased, and that goes down to things I just simply can't control. Like, yeah, I can walk down the hall in my office here and not shake people's hands, but I mean, I still have to drink water. I still have to eat food. And of course, those all can be potential vectors, particularly water, because this is something that I do definitely am drinking, an avid water drinker, so I'm drinking quite often. I don't have a mountain and stream, mountain water that I can get. I do have water system, and I try to take care of that, but I understand that I'm not completely eliminating the exposure. I'm doing the best that I can. Also, you talked about going outside and being barefoot. Uh, you know,
I
where I
never do
live in
that
my community,
intentionally. It's just kind of how I live, right?
well, that's wonderful. But in my community, I'm not going to go walk downtown Phoenix barefoot. Probably not
Yeah,
the smartest idea,
right,
right?
right. You're gonna step on a needle and
Right.
then some mushy material here and there. Yeah.
Right. So I think it definitely comes down to the situation that you're in and understanding the trade-offs. But I am definitely a big proponent of trying to live closer to um, or take a more ancestral type approach. Obviously, you can't do everything, but it's a good place to start when you start thinking about basic tenets of health, whether it be parasitic infections or nutrition or hydration, even exercise. I think that's really important to consider. And this space in particular, there this the third the craving for knowledge, I think, is wonderful, but sometimes because this space does really do well in kind of looking or accepting the ancestral type perspective, but then at the other end, say the parasites come in. I've known many individuals that will just take all these different types of dietary supplements, or like even I said, one person that had taken indiscriminate broad spectrum antibiotics. You kind of get these kind of at odds approaches. So in terms of parasites, they are prevalent. As I said, I mean, for instance, with giardia, 7%, that I was around 7%. Again, according to the CDC, pinworms. Again, those are a little bit more common in children, but I think last I looked, it's around 10 or 11% in the United States. So that's definitely not trivial. So I don't think people are off base, particularly if they have some type of underlying health condition, in at least considering parasites. But we had talked about the microbiome before. You can have pathogenic bacteria that wouldn't necessarily be classified as a parasite, but could be promoting a lot of these symptoms that people might think could be a result of, say, like an intestinal worm, or something of that nature. So the microbiome test, if you are getting, say, you're getting a fairly good panel for detecting parasites, you don't really find anything. Another great place you could look at is your gut microbiome, particularly if you're having any type of gastrointestinal symptomology, which we know in the United States most people do. And whether or not you like the term dysbiosis, or basically being out of a homeostatic state with your microbiome, is very common in the United States, western parts of the world, that I think you and I agree that people should also look at.
Yeah, so there's so many interesting branches we could go off of. Real quick, I wanted to comment too when you're saying like building a compound and living. I'm like, I don't know if you're aware, but I'm kind of doing that. Not in
That's
a,
okay.
not in a cultish sense, but like,
Sure.
yeah, we have anyway. Yeah, that's kind of more the private side of my life, so I don't share that on social media or anything, in the sense that like I just want my home space to be my home space. But it is, I think, really good to have a small local community of people that you're doing life with and involved with, and keeping it relatively small where you can. And then I travel a lot too, so I think that's understandable, and taking into account, like you said, your particular environment, and just doing what you can in that environment is the best you can do, right? So, but getting back to, so if I wanted to understand and get a profiling of say parasites in my body, you have something that's coming out, which will be a test that not only is it the same test for the microbiome and the parasites? Is it going to be the same sample collection method? Is it going to be different? Or I know you're trying to sync that up right now, but what do you think it's going to end up being?
We're going to have it included with the normal sample collection. So there won't be any additional special testing that you need to do. It will be part of the panel. We're right now kind of piloting the best collection method to get the most robust sample. Unfortunately, unlike the blood test that we offer, I mean, most people are pretty good with handling a lancet, getting some blood out. There are obviously people that are squeamish.
And that's
Fecal
a finger
matter
prick,
is
by the way, for
it's
people
a finger.
listening.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a fingerprint, correct. I mean, handling fecal matter, it's a little bit different. Obviously, there's a gross factor, but also we want to make sure that we're getting the most viable sample. So, for those that haven't ever had a fecal sample or haven't done some type of similar test like a fecal occult, you want to get a sample that's not been contaminated with anything, maybe in your toilet water or it came into contact with, I don't know, some type of chemical or whatever. You want to get a fresh sample right out of where you're excreting it from the anus. So there's different methods. There's catches that catch your whole fecal sample, and you take an aliquot. There's something that we're looking into, which is a wipe, which is a very nice, discreet way to take a sample. But basically, we're trying to ensure right now that we're able to get the most representative, homogenizing a full fecal sample and getting every microbe. We don't want to miss anything. But in that sequencing that we're getting done, we're also looking at different DNA fragments. Basically, with our approach, we're doing what we call shotgun metagenomics, where we basically have all these different fragments, genomic material that we're able to benchmark against our library, where we have different microbes and also parasites basically there, so we can profile and understand what you have in your particular sample.
So how many parasites are going to be in this panel? Like, how many do you think you'll be able to identify ideally?
Ideally, we're aiming for a panel of 30. Now, I'm not saying we're going to be able to, capture everything, obviously. And it is going to come down to how you are collecting your sample. Again, that comes this what we're piloting right now, but also following directions, which we know is difficult for some people. We just want to make sure that everything is super clear so that they can get the best sample. And the one thing that concerns me a little bit about the wipe is I guess everyone has a different technique when they wipe. So we just want to make sure that those instructions are clear and that we get basically a uniform sample.
So 30 parasites you think you'll ideally be able to make out in a test like this. Why did you choose, or why these 30 are, because you mentioned a couple that you're like, well, these are the most prevalent ones in the United States. What are these other 28 or 25? What are kind of some of the, just give me a little bit of knowledge on that.
Yeah, a lot of these are the single-celled protozoa.
Mm-hmm.
So, the larger helminths is what they call them. They're basically a class of different types of worms. Those can actually survive. If you go untreated, those can survive for long periods of time in your gastrointestinal tract. Months, years. I mean, tapeworms, of course. But those are extremely large. And normally, like I said, you can do very simplistic tests like the Scotch tape test, where you're basically you have eggs. I mean, it's pretty simple. There are other techniques, culturing techniques,
but it's nice to have it all in one spot.
Yes, of course. We are trying to go after the I guess the more prevalent parasites, but we're also, the unique part of our test is we're trying to uncover some of the ones that are more difficult to detect, and that. The reason I quoted you
like
30
what?
is because we're trying to build out a catalog for some of these rare
So what kind of timeline do you think be prepared to roll a test like this out, where it's kind of this one-stop shop for only parasites, but understanding of the microbiome?
Well, we're hoping to do that reasonably if we have all our stars aligned. Beginning of next year. I think that's a timeline that I'm comfortable saying with. It is possible that it could come out sooner, but to bring the most robust tests and to make sure that we have our library properly built out to annotate not only the bacteria, the fungi, the archaea, but also, as I was saying, this parasite panel. That's what I feel comfortable with.
Any closing remarks that you want to make?
Well, again, based on the how prevalent these are in globally, and then obviously where, the areas that we live in, they are something, that you can get for sure. So I'm not dismissing them as maybe being attributable to some kind of underlying health condition that you have. I think people should just be a little bit more skeptical, and be reasonable with what these can do, and how we can profile them, because there are some really good traditional methods out there, and of course, what we're hoping to bring to the market, to get a better, perhaps more global profile of these. But that's it.